You've just woken up in a land of ice and shadow, long before the names of kings or the clang of church bells would echo through its forests. The year is not yet written in any human record. It is perhaps 12,000 years before the birth of Christ. The last great ice age has only just begun to retreat, its colossal glaciers groaning as they melt, carving deep fjords into the bedrock, filling valleys with cold, clear water, and slowly revealing a raw, untouched landscape. The air is sharp with the scent of wet stone, moss, and the faint tang of distant pine. There is no Sweden yet, not as a nation, not as a people, but the land is here, waiting. If you look around, you will see no towns, no farms, no roads, only the wilderness in its primal majesty. And yet, you are not alone. In the distance, a flicker of light, a small, controlled fire. Huddled around it are the first humans to walk this land. They are hunters, survivors, wanderers who followed the reindeer herds north as the ice receded, chasing the edge of habitable Earth. Their tools are made of flint and bone, their clothes stitched from animal hides. They speak a language long lost to time, their stories carried only in the rhythm of the drum and the lines of ochre drawn on cave walls. This is where our story begins. Not with crowns or conquests, but with footprints in melting snow. The human story in what would become Sweden begins in the late Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, stretching from roughly 12,000 to 4,000 BCE. These earliest inhabitants were not farmers, but mobile or semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, living in small kinship groups that moved with the seasons, tracking elk, seals, and migrating birds. Archaeological evidence from eastern central Sweden shows continuous human presence from as early as 7,500 BCE, with settlements often located near lakes or coastlines where resources were abundant. Their world was one of intimate knowledge of tides, animal behavior, plant cycles. They crafted sophisticated microliths, tiny, razor-sharp stone blades used in composite tools, and built simple dwellings from wood and hide. Though few of their names survive, their presence is etched into the land. Shell middens along the coast, hearths buried beneath forest loam, and the haunting rock carvings of Tanum in Bohuslän, which depict ships, warriors, plows, and sun wheels, visions of a cosmos already rich with meaning. Around 4,000 BCE, a quiet revolution began. From the south, across the Baltic, came new people carrying new ideas. The funnel beaker culture. They brought with them the knowledge of farming, cultivating wheat, barley, and legumes, and the domestication of cattle, sheep, and pigs. This marked the Neolithic period in Sweden, a time when the old ways of the hunter began to blend with the settled life of the farmer. With agriculture came permanence. People built longhouses, erected megalithic passage graves, massive stone tombs that still stand today, and began to shape the landscape with field systems and ritual enclosures. Around 3,400 BCE, another group emerged, the pitted ware culture, centered in east-central Sweden. They appear to have maintained a more maritime, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, even as the Neolithic spread, suggesting a complex tapestry of coexistence, resistance, and cultural fusion. Then came the metal. Around 1,700 BCE, bronze arrived, flowing into Scandinavia through trade networks that stretched to the Alps and beyond. This was not just a technological shift, it was a social and spiritual transformation. The Nordic Bronze Age, as it's known, was an era of extraordinary artistic expression and hierarchical society. Elites were buried beneath enormous tumuli, burial mounds, accompanied by weapons, jewelry, and imported goods that signaled wealth and far-reaching connections. The rock art of this period explodes in complexity. Images of ships dominate, some with crews of dozens, others bearing solar symbols suggesting ritual voyages, trade expeditions, or mythic journeys to the afterlife. Weapons, chariots, and ritual scenes hint at a warrior aristocracy, while the frequent depiction of the sun points to a cosmology centered on celestial cycles and divine forces. Bronze was not smelted locally. It was imported as ingots, then recast into swords, axes, and ornate spiral jewelry objects that were as much about status and ritual as they were about utility. This era lasted until roughly 500 BCE, when a new metal changed everything once again: iron. The Iron Age in Sweden is traditionally divided into the pre-Roman Iron Age, 501 BCE, Roman Iron Age, 1400 CE, and Migration, Vendel period, 400-700 CE. Iron, unlike bronze, could be smelted from local bog ore, making it more accessible and democratizing toolmaking, though elites still controlled the best weapons and armor. During the Roman Iron Age, Sweden's connections to the wider world deepened. Roman coins, glassware, and weapons have been found in southern Sweden, evidence of trade along the Amber Road, a route that carried Baltic amber south to the Mediterranean in exchange for luxury goods. Society became increasingly stratified, with powerful chieftains ruling from fortified settlements, presiding over assemblies, things, and commissioning rune stones, though the runic script itself would not appear until the very end of this period. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, Sweden entered what archaeologists call the Vendel period, named after a rich burial site in Uppland. Here, grand ship burials were uncovered, precursors to the Viking Age, filled with gilded helmets, ornate shields, gaming boards, and sacrificed horses. These were not mere graves. They were statements of power, linking the deceased to mythic ancestors and cosmic order. The society that buried its dead in such splendor was primed for expansion, for trade, for war. And so, as the 7th century drew to a close, the stage was set. The small chiefdoms of Iron Age Sweden would soon coalesce. The ships would grow larger, the sails would turn eastward. The age of the Russ, the Varangians, the far-traveling Swedes was about to begin. But for now, in the deep silence of the pine forests, the echo of a stone axe striking wood is the only sound. The ice has melted. The land is settled. The story is just beginning. You're still standing in that post-glacial dawn, the land raw and newly revealed beneath melting ice. The air is colder than you expect. Even in summer, Scandinavia's latitude means long, luminous days in June, but also a sky that never truly warms. The forests are not yet the dense pine and spruce tapestries of later centuries. They are open woodlands of birch, aspen, and willow, where reindeer pick their way through mossy clearings, and bears leave claw marks on trunks. There are no borders here, no names for rivers or mountains, only the slow accumulation of human memory, passed from parent to child around fires that flicker against the deep Nordic night. We've already touched on the arrival of the first hunter-gatherers, but let us go deeper into the rhythm of their days, the texture of their lives, the silent decisions that shaped millennia. These Mesolithic people did not live in isolation. Though their groups numbered perhaps 20 to 30 individuals, they maintained vast social networks that stretched across the Baltic and into continental Europe. Flint from Denmark, red slate from Norway, amber from the coast all moved through invisible threads of exchange, kinship, and seasonal rendezvous. A burial in eastern Sweden might contain a pendant made from elk tooth shaped in Finland, proof that identity was not just local, but regional, even intercultural. Their tools tell a story of precision and adaptation. Flint knappers, specialists within the group, could produce a blade with a single strike, so sharp it could slice tendon or gutfish with surgical accuracy. Bonals stitched hides into garments that shed wind and rain. Antler harpoons, barbed and weighted, brought seals from the icy sea. And always, the fire central, not just for warmth and cooking, but as a social anchor, a place where stories were told, songs hummed, and the boundaries between the living, the dead, and the spirit world were thinnest. Archaeologists have found evidence of ritual behavior even in this earliest period. At sites like Hummelskog and Skåne, human remains were buried in crouched positions, knees drawn to the chest, as if returning to the womb of the earth. Some graves contain red ochre, a pigment associated with life and blood sprinkled over the bones. Others include grave goods, a child buried with a necklace of animal teeth, an elder with a finely crafted axe. Death was not an end, but a transition, and these people prepared their loved ones for the journey ahead. As the climate continued to warm, forests thickened, and coastlines stabilized, the human footprint grew more permanent. By 5000 BCE, the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from foraging to farming crept into southern Sweden, not as an invasion, but as a quiet diffusion of ideas. The funnel beaker culture, named for their distinctive pottery, cleared small patches of forest, using stone axes and fire, planting emmer wheat, barley, and flax. They domesticated cattle, not just for meat, but for milk and traction, revolutionizing labor and diet. This was not an easy transition. Farming in Sweden's short growing season was precarious. A single late frost, a wet summer, or a rodent infestation could mean starvation. Yet the rewards, predictable food, stored surplus, settled life allowed communities to grow. They built longhouses, some over 20 meters in length, with walls of wattle and daub and roofs of thatch or turf. Inside, generations lived together, sharing hearths, chores, and dreams. Alongside farming came ritual architecture. The most striking are the megalithic passage graves, like those at Falbygden in western Sweden. Built from massive glacial boulders hauled by human muscle and rope, these tombs could house dozens of burials over centuries. The entrance, aligned with the setting sun on the winter solstice, suggests a cosmology tied to seasonal cycles and ancestor veneration. To enter such a tomb was to walk into the belly of the earth, to commune with those who came before. But not everyone embraced this new world. In the archipelagos of east-central Sweden, the pitted ware culture clung to the old ways, hunting seals, fishing cod, gathering shellfish. Their pottery is decorated with finger-pitted patterns, their settlements clustered near rich marine resources. Genetic studies suggest they were largely distinct from the farming communities to the south, possibly descended from earlier hunter-gatherer lineages. For centuries, these two worlds coexisted, sometimes trading, sometimes competing, sometimes intermarrying. Then, around 2800 BCE, a new wave arrived. The battle axe culture, bearers of the corded ware tradition, likely speaking an early form of Proto-Indo-European. They brought individual burials, horse domestication, though evidence in Sweden is sparse, and a more hierarchical social order. With them came the first evidence of wheeled vehicles and metallurgy, heralding the dawn of the Bronze Age. And so, the land that would become Sweden was never a blank slate. It was a palimpsest, each layer of settlers, each wave of innovation, riding over the last but never erasing it completely. The deep past echoes in the present, in the names of rivers, many of non-Germanic origin, in the genetic makeup of modern Swedes, a blend of hunter, gatherer, farmer, and steppe ancestry, and in the stubborn resilience of a people shaped by a harsh but beautiful land. By the time bronze began to flow into the Nordic world around 1700 BCE, southern Sweden was already a mosaic of cultures, beliefs, and lifeways. The Nordic Bronze Age was not just an era of metal, it was an era of myth-making. Consider the rock carvings of Tanum now. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine longships crashing onto English beaches, berserkers roaring with axes raised, monks fleeing burning monasteries. And while that Western narrative is real, it belongs largely to the Danes and Norwegians. The Swedish Vikings, known to their contemporaries as the Sphere, and later as the Rus, took a different path. They turned east, from the shores of Lake Mälaren, from the island of Gotland, from the river mouths of the Göta Älv. They launched their ships not into the stormy North Sea, but into the calm, winding waterways of the Baltic, and from there, they followed the rivers thousands of kilometers inland into the heart of Eastern Europe. Their goal was not plunder, but profit. The Swedish Vikings were above all, traders. They dealt in furs, beaver, sable, marten harvested from the Arctic forests of the north. They traded walrus ivory, amber from the southern Baltic, honey, wax, and, most controversially, slaves, captured in raids on the Baltic coast or bought from Slavic middlemen. These captives, Slavs, Balts, Finns, were marched south and sold in the great markets of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Byzantine Empire. In return, the Swedes brought back silver, silks, spices, and glassware. Over 80,000 Islamic silver coins, dirhams, have been found in Swedish hoards, particularly on Gotland, each one a testament to a vast commercial network stretching from Birka to Baghdad. 4. At the center of this early Swedish trade empire stood Birka, a fortified trading town on the island of Björka in Lake Mälaren. Founded around 750 CE, Birka was not a village, but a cosmopolitan hub. Archaeologists have uncovered graves of warriors buried with Frankish swords, Arab scales, and Chinese silk. One grave, that of a high-status woman known as the Birka warrior, initially assumed male due to her weaponry, was later confirmed through DNA to be female, suggesting that women in Viking-Age Sweden could hold roles of significant military or ritual authority. Birka had workshops, docks, markets, and a Christian burial ground, proving that even before official conversion, foreign faiths had begun to seep into Norse society. It was here that Swedish elites first encountered the world beyond the fjords, not as raiders, but as merchants, diplomats, and negotiators. But Birka was just the beginning. From the Baltic coast, Swedish Vikings sailed east to the Gulf of Finland, then up the Neva River to Ladoga, the oldest known town in Russia. From Ladoga, they navigated the Volkhov River to Novgorod, which they called Holmgård, the island court. And from Novgorod, they followed the Dnieper River south, past rapids guarded by hostile tribes, all the way to Kiev, and finally to Constantinople, the fabled Miklagard, the great city. This route, the trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks, was the commercial backbone of the early medieval world, and the men who sailed it were known not as Vikings, but as Varangians. According to the Primary Chronicle, a 12th century Slavic text, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the region, tired of internal conflict, sent a message to the Varangians. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. In response, 3 brothers, Rurik, Cineas, and Truver, arrived. Rurik settled in Novgorod and founded the Rurikid dynasty, which would rule Kievan Rus and later Muscovy and Russia for over 700 years. Modern historians debate whether this calling of the Varangians was literal or mythologized, but the archaeological evidence is clear. Scandinavian presence in early Ruses was profound. Burial mounds near Kiev contain Norse-style weapons, jewelry, and ship rivets. Runestones in Sweden, like the Turin runestone, commemorate men who died in the east with Ingvar, referring to the ill-fated expedition of Ingvar the Far-Traveled, who led a massive fleet down the Caspian Sea in the 1040 seconds and died, along with most of his men, in what may have been a failed invasion of Persia. And then there is Anand, Erik Anundsen, and Bjorn Ironside, semi-legendary kings, said to have ruled vast swathes of Sweden and the East. While their historicity is hazy, their names persist in sagas as symbols of Sweden's eastern ambition. But while the men sailed east, back home, a quieter revolution was unfolding: Christianity. In the late 10th century, King Olof Skutkonung, son of the powerful Erik the Victorious, became the first Christian king of Sweden. His conversion was not born of spiritual epiphany, but of political pragmatism. The Holy Roman Empire to the south was Christian. Trade with Christian Europe required Christian rulers, and the Church offered literacy, law, and legitimacy. Olof established Sweden's first bishopric in Skara, in Västergötland, and minted the first Swedish coins, silver pennies bearing his name and a cross. Yet his reign was fraught. The old pagan cult at Gamla Uppsala, with its great temple, sacred grove, and 9-year sacrificial festivals, remained powerful. The assembly of free men resisted centralized rule, and rival chieftains clung to the old gods of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. It would take another century for Christianity to fully take root. But Olaf's reign marked the beginning of the end of the old ways and the birth of something new, Sweden. Not just as a collection of tribes, but as a kingdom. By the late 11th century, the Swedish Viking Age was fading. The great eastern trade routes were now controlled by Slavic princes. The church was building stone churches where wooden temples once stood, and the era of the independent chieftain was giving way to the era of the crown. The last great Viking king of Sweden, Inge the Elder, banned pagan sacrifices at Uppsala and faced rebellion for it. But he prevailed. The old gods were not forgotten, but they were no longer served with blood. And so, as the 12th century dawned, Sweden stood at a crossroads. It had been shaped by the sea, the sword, and the silver of distant lands. Now, it would be forged anew by the cross, the crown, and the relentless pull of medieval Christendom. The conversion to Christianity was never a clean break. It was a slow seep, like water through thatched roofs, persistent, inevitable, and at times resisted. Long after King Olaf Skutkonung accepted baptism around the year 1000, the great pagan temple at Gamla Uppsala still drew crowds for its 9-year sacrificial festivals, where men, dogs, and horses were hanged in sacred groves, their bodies left to rot as offerings to Odin, Thor, and Freyr. But by the 12th century, the axe of Christendom had fallen. King Inge the Elder, ruling in the early 1100s, refused to participate in the pagan rites. When the people demanded he uphold tradition, he reportedly set fire to the temple itself, burning the wooden idols and scattering the cult. Whether true or embellished by Christian chroniclers, the story symbolizes a turning point. The old gods were being driven into memory, their sacred spaces repurposed for crosses and choirs. With the church came literacy. Before Christianity, the Norse used runes practical, ritual, and memorial, but not for law, theology, or administration. Now, Latin scribes arrived from Germany and Denmark, bringing with them charters, chronicles, and canon law. The first Swedish bishoprics were established. Skara, T. 1014, Linköping, 1100, Uppsala, 1164. The last elevated to an archbishopric, making Sweden ecclesiastically independent from the Danish church. This was more than spiritual conquest. It was institutional colonization. The church claimed tithes, a tenth of all produce from every peasant. It acquired vast tracts of land, exempt from royal taxation. Monasteries like Vreda and Nidala became centers of agriculture, education, and political influence. And the clergy, often sons of nobles, formed a new elite, fluent in Latin, connected to Rome, and loyal to a power beyond the king. But the king was trying to build his own power, and here lay the central tension of medieval Sweden, the struggle between crown, church, and nobility. Unlike England or France, Sweden had no strong tradition of hereditary monarchy. Kings were often elected by the Thing, the assembly of free men chosen from competing dynasties like the House of Sverker and the House of Erik. This system bred instability. Between 1156 and 1250, Sweden saw at least 6 kings murdered, often by rivals claiming divine right or popular mandate. Take Erik Edvardsson, later Saint Erik, a pious king who sought to impose tithes and centralize law. He was killed in 1160 by a rival faction led by Magnus Henriksson, a man with Danish backing and noble grievances. Erik's body was left in the street, but the church quickly canonized him, turning a murdered politician into a national saint. His relics housed in Uppsala as a symbol of divine kingship. This pattern repeated. Violence followed by sanctification. Chaos followed by sacred order. Meanwhile, the Swedish crown turned its gaze eastward. Finland, inhabited by Finnic tribes and Tavastians, was not yet part of the realm. But Christian missionaries, backed by Swedish bishops and adventurers, began raiding and preaching along the coast. The so-called First Swedish Crusade, 1,150 seconds, though likely later, is shrouded in myth, but its outcome was real. Sweden established a foothold in southwestern Finland, founding the Bishopric of Turku, and beginning a centuries-long process of cultural and political domination. This eastern expansion was not just religious, it was economic and demographic. Swedish settlers moved into coastal Finland, building towns, clearing forests, and imposing their language and law. The native Sami and Finnic peoples were gradually marginalized, their lands absorbed into the growing Swedish realm, a colonial process that would continue for centuries. Back in Sweden, the 13th century brought a fragile stability under the Folkung dynasty. Kings like Birger Jarl regent and de facto ruler from 1248 were masterful statesmen. He crushed noble rebellions, reformed the legal system, and founded Stockholm around 1252 as a strategic stronghold to control trade on Lake Mälaren and defend against pirates. Birger Jarl also oversaw the national church law and land law, Sweden's first attempts at unified legislation. These laws recognize three estates: nobles, clergy, and peasants. Though the vast majority of Swedes were freeholding peasants with rights to speak at the Thing, own land, and bear arms, serfdom, common in much of Europe, never took root in Sweden, a fact that would shape its social fabric for centuries. But even as Sweden coalesced, a new threat emerged from the south: Denmark. The three Scandinavian kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, had long been rivals. But in 1397, under the regency of Queen Margaret I of Denmark, they were united in the Kalmar Union, a personal union under a single monarch, intended to counter the rising power of the Hanseatic League. Sweden, the largest and most decentralized of the three, chafed under Danish rule. Danish kings like Eric of Pomerania and Christian had treated Sweden as a source of taxes and soldiers, appointing foreign bailiffs and ignoring Swedish law. The Swedish nobility, fiercely protective of their privileges, grew resentful. Rebellion became a cycle. Uprisings flared in the 1,430 seconds, 1,450 seconds, and 1,460 seconds. Leaders like Karl Knutson Bond were elected king by the Swedish council, only to be deposed by Danish force. The union was less a union and more a state of intermittent civil war. Then came Christian II of Denmark. In 1520, after a long campaign to reclaim Sweden, Christian II entered Stockholm and was crowned king. To secure his rule, he invited Swedish nobles, bishops, and burghers to a coronation banquet. For 3 days, there was feasting, music, and promises of reconciliation. On the 4th day, the 8th of November, 1520, the doors were barred. What followed became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. Over 3 days, nearly 100 Swedish leaders, including bishops, mayors, and nobles, were dragged into the town square and beheaded. Their crime? Supporting the previous rebel king, Christian II claimed he was purging heretics under papal sanction, but the massacre was nakedly political. Among the dead was Gustav Eriksson, Vasa's father and uncle. Gustav, a young nobleman who had escaped to Dalarna, would soon ignite a fire that would burn the Kalmar Union to the ground. Gustav had been in the city only weeks before, imprisoned in a tower by King Christian II of Denmark, the same monarch who now claimed the Swedish throne as part of the Kalmar Union. But Gustav escaped. Some say he slid down a rope woven from bed sheets. Others claim he bribed a guard with a silver buckle. Whatever the truth, he fled north to Dalarna, the rugged, forested province where free peasants still held sway and Danish tax collectors feared to tread. There, in the smoky longhouses of Mora, Gustav made his plea. He stood before the Thing, the assembly of free men, and recounted the Stockholm bloodbath. He named the dead, bishops, burghers, nobles, his own kin. He spoke not as a nobleman demanding loyalty, but as a Swede begging for justice. At first, the peasants were reluctant. They had no love for the king in Copenhagen, but rebellion meant war, and war meant burned villages, conscripted sons, and empty larders. Gustav left Mora empty-handed. But as news of the massacre spread, carried by traitors, priests, and fugitives, the mood shifted. The bloodbath was not just a purge. It was a declaration that Sweden had no right to exist as a separate realm, that its laws, its assemblies, its very identity were subordinate to Danish will. And so, weeks later, a group of men from Mora rode after Gustav, catching him at the border of Norway. "Come back," they said. "We will fight." This moment, the ride of the Dalecarlians, is the spark that lit the Swedish War of Liberation. The war that followed was not a grand clash of armies, but a guerrilla struggle. A series of ambushes, sieges, and peasant uprisings across central Sweden. Gustav had no treasury, no standing army, and no foreign allies. But he had something more potent: legitimacy. He was not fighting for personal ambition, but for the ancient rights of the Swedish realm, the right to elect its own king, to govern by its own laws, to speak at the thing without fear of execution. These were not abstract ideals. They were the bedrock of Swedish identity. By 1523, after 3 years of relentless campaigning, the tide turned. Lübeck, the powerful Hanseatic city, seeing an opportunity to weaken Denmark, sent ships and mercenaries to support Gustav. With their help, Swedish forces retook Stockholm. The Danish garrison surrendered. And on the 6th of June 1523, a date now celebrated as Sweden's National Day, Gustav Eriksson was elected King of Sweden by the Assembly in Strängnäs. He took the name Gustav I Vasa, founding a dynasty that would rule for over a century. But liberation was only the beginning. Sweden was broke, fractured, and vulnerable. Its economy relied on exporting raw materials, iron, copper, timber, while importing nearly everything else. The church owned over 20% of arable land, its bishops wielding more power than many nobles. And the Kalmar Union, though shattered, remained a threat. Denmark would not easily relinquish its claim to the north. Gustav faced a choice: rebuild slowly or seize control with ruthless efficiency. He chose the latter. His first target was the Catholic Church. For centuries, the church had been a pillar of Swedish life, but also a rival power center loyal to Rome, not Uppsala. When Pope Clement VII refused to recognize Gustav's election, due to pressure from Christian II, the king saw his opportunity. In 1527, at the Diet of Västerås, Gustav forced the Swedish church to submit. Bishops surrendered their castles and estates. Monasteries were dissolved. Church lands were confiscated by the crown. And the king appointed a new archbishop, Laurentius Petri, a Swedish reformer who would oversee the creation of a Lutheran national church. This was not just religious reform, it was economic revolution. The seized lands made the crown the largest landowner in Sweden. The revenues funded a standing army, a royal bureaucracy, and the first centralized state administration in Swedish history. The people? They were given the Swedish language Bible, translated by Laurentius and his brother Olaus. For the first time, Swedes could read scripture in their own tongue. Sermons were no longer Latin mysteries but moral instructions in familiar words. The church became a tool of the state but also a unifying force in a still fragmented nation. Yet Gustav's rule was not gentle. He demanded obedience. He crushed noble rebellions with fire and sword. He imposed heavy taxes, even on peasants who had fought for him. And he centralized power to an unprecedented degree, appointing royal bailiffs to every province, bypassing local assemblies. To his critics, he was a tyrant. To his successors, he was the father of the nation. When he died in 1560, he left behind a stable, independent Sweden, unified, Protestant, and fiercely sovereign. His sons, however, would test that legacy to its limits. Gustav's eldest son, Eric XIV, inherited the throne in 1560. Brilliant but unstable, Eric was a Renaissance prince, fluent in multiple languages, obsessed with astrology, and deeply paranoid. He expanded Sweden's navy, modernized its artillery, and dreamed of making Sweden a Baltic empire. But his mind unraveled. He suspected plots everywhere, even among his own brothers. In 1567, during a fit of madness, he ordered the Sture murders, executing several high-ranking nobles, including members of the powerful Sture family. His brothers John and Charles feared they were next. John, Duke of Finland, rebelled. With support from Poland, whose princess he had married, he defeated Eric's forces and imprisoned him in 1568. Eric would die 9 years later, likely poisoned, in a dungeon at Urbyhus Castle. John III now ruled, but his reign was torn between Catholic sympathies, influenced by his Polish wife, and Lutheran realities. He introduced a new liturgy, the Red Book, that blended Catholic ritual with Protestant doctrine, sparking outrage among hardline Lutherans. The church split, the nobility seethed, and his younger brother, Duke Charles, began to position himself as the defender of true Swedish Lutheranism. When John died in 1592, his son Sigismund, already King of Poland, claimed the Swedish throne. But Sigismund was a Catholic, and the Swedish clergy and nobility would not accept a pope-aligned monarch. Duke Charles rallied opposition, defeated Sigismund's forces at the Battle of Stångebro in 1598, and declared himself regent. In 1604, the Riksdag formally deposed Sigismund, and in 1611, Charles was crowned Charles IX, the third Vasa king, and the most militant defender of Swedish Protestantism. But Charles's reign was short. He died that same year, leaving the throne to his 7-year-old son, Gustavus Adolphus, a boy with a stammer, a scholar's mind, and a destiny that would shake Europe to its core. The stage was set. Sweden was no longer a backwater kingdom. It was a Protestant fortress, a centralized state, and a rising military power. And under its new king, Gustav II, Adolf, it would become the Lion of the North. But Gustavus Adolphus, Gustav II, Adolf, is still a boy. He was born in 1594, the son of Charles IX, a stern, devout Lutheran who ruled with an iron hand and a deep suspicion of foreign influence. From childhood, Gustavus was groomed for leadership. He learned Latin, German, and several Slavic dialects. He studied military history, theology, and law. By age 11, he was attending meetings of the Riksdag. By 13, he was appointed Duke of Estonia, a Swedish dominion acquired during the Livonian War. His stammer, a source of childhood shame, only sharpened his mind. He learned to write with extraordinary precision, to listen intently, and to speak only when necessary, when every word had to carry weight. When his father died in 1611, Gustavus inherited a kingdom under siege. Denmark, under Christian IV, saw Sweden's youth as weakness. He launched the Kalmar War, seizing key fortresses and blockading Swedish ports. Russia, under Tsar Michael Romanov, pressed from the east, and Poland, ruled by his cousin Sigismund III, continued to claim the Swedish throne. Sweden was surrounded, but Gustavus did not panic. At 17 years old, he took control of state affairs with a maturity that stunned his council. He negotiated peace with Denmark in 1613, ceding some territory but preserving Sweden's core. He signed a truce with Russia in 1617, securing Finland and gaining Ingria, including the mouth of the Neva River, a strategic foothold that would later become St. Petersburg. Then he turned his full attention to Poland. What followed was the Polish-Swedish War, 1629, a grinding, decades-long conflict over the Baltic littoral. Gustavus reformed the Swedish army from the ground up. Ditching the traditional mercenary model, he created a national conscript army, disciplined, well-paid, and loyal to the crown. He introduced lighter artillery, mobile infantry, and combined arms tactics coordinating cavalry, musketeers, and cannons in fluid, devastating formations. His victory at the Battle of Walhof, 1626, and the Battle of Dachau, 1627, proved Sweden could stand toe-to-toe with Europe's greatest powers. By 1629, the Truce of Altmark granted Sweden control over Livonia, Prussia's key ports, and a share of Polish toll revenue, making Sweden the dominant power in the eastern Baltic. But Gustavus had bigger ambitions. Europe was tearing itself apart in the 30 Years' War. 1618, 1648. A cataclysmic conflict that began as a religious struggle between Protestants and Catholics, but evolved into a war for dominance among the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and Northern powers. The Protestant cause was collapsing. The Catholic forces of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, led by the brilliant general Albrecht von Wallenstein, had crushed rebel armies across Germany. Cities burned, populations fled. The dream of a free Protestant Europe seemed lost. Then, in 1630, Gustavus Adolphus landed in Pomerania with 13,000 men. He did not come as a mercenary. He came as the protector of Protestantism and as a king determined to make Sweden a great power. His entry into the war changed everything. At the Battle of Breitenfeld, 1631, Gustavus faced the imperial army of Johann Tilly, using innovative linear tactics, spreading his infantry in thin, flexible lines rather than deep squares. He outmaneuvered the enemy. His artillery fired canister shot at close range. His cavalry charged with swords, not pistols, breaking imperial flanks with terrifying speed. The result? A decisive Protestant victory. For the first time in over a decade, the Catholic advance was halted. Cities that had surrendered to the emperor now opened their gates to the Swedish king. Gustavus was hailed as the Lion of the North, a messianic figure sent by God to save the Reformation. He marched south, winning battle after battle: Würzburg, Mainz, Frankfurt. By 1632, he controlled much of central Germany. But greatness comes at a price. On the 6th of November 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus led a cavalry charge through thick fog to rally his faltering troops. In the chaos, he became separated from his men. Surrounded by imperial cuirassiers, he was shot multiple times and fell from his horse. His body was found the next day, stripped of armor, his face unrecognizable. He was 37 years old. His death sent shockwaves through Europe. The Protestant alliance wavered, but Sweden did not retreat, because Gustavus had built more than an army. He had built a state. Back in Stockholm, his 6-year-old daughter, Christina, was proclaimed queen. Power fell to a regency council led by Axel Oxenstierna, Gustavus's brilliant chancellor, a man who would spend the next 18 years defending the empire his king had forged. And Sweden's empire would not only endure, it would expand, because in Stockholm, a new architect of empire is watching, calculating, and holding the fragile threads of state together with hands steady as stone. This is Axel Oxenstierna, Chancellor of Sweden. While Gustavus was the sword, Oxenstierna was the shield, and the parchment, the ink, the law, the ledger. A nobleman of immense intellect and ice-cold pragmatism, he had served Gustavus since the king was a boy of 17. Now, with his king dead and his queen a child of 6, Oxenstierna became the de facto ruler of Sweden for the next 18 years. His task was Herculean: preserve the empire. Sweden now controlled vast territories: Livonia, modern Latvia and Estonia, Ingria, Kexholm, parts of Pomerania, Bremen, and Wismar. These were not just conquests. They were administrative nightmares populated by Germans, Balts, Slavs, and Poles, each with their own laws, languages, and loyalties. The risk of rebellion was constant. The cost of garrisoning troops was crushing. And the other European powers, France, Spain, the Habsburgs, were watching. waiting for Sweden to overextend and collapse. Oxenstierna's answer was the Instrument of Government, 1634, a document that would shape Swedish administration for over a century. It established 5 great offices of state: Chancery, Treasury, War, Admiralty, and Justice. Each was headed by a noble loyal to the crown, creating a professional bureaucracy that bypassed the old feudal chaos. Provinces were governed by royal governors, not local warlords. Tax collection was centralized. And, crucially, the Swedish language was imposed as the language of administration in all dominions, binding the empire together with a single bureaucratic tongue. But Oxenstierna knew Sweden could not survive alone. Even in death, Gustavus's intervention in Germany had shifted the balance of power. The Protestant cause was no longer on the brink, and Sweden, though small, was now a guarantor of the European order. Oxenstierna formalized an alliance with France, a Catholic nation backing a Protestant power, not out of faith, but out of realpolitik. France wanted to weaken the Habsburgs. Sweden needed gold and diplomatic cover. The alliance held, and Swedish generals like Lennart Torstensson and Johan Bonner continued to win battles across Germany, pushing imperial forces back year after year. By 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia finally ended the 30 Years' War, Sweden stood at its zenith. The treaty granted Sweden Western Pomerania, the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden, and a seat in the imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire. Sweden was now a great power, not by population or wealth, but by military precision, strategic positioning, and relentless statecraft. But the cost was staggering. Over 100,000 Swedish soldiers, nearly 10% of the adult male population, had perished in Germany. Entire villages were depopulated. Farms lay fallow, and the national debt was immense. Back home, the young Queen Christina was growing up under Oxenstierna's watchful eye. Brilliant, restless, and deeply skeptical of power, she devoured philosophy, studied Latin and Greek, and questioned everything from Lutheran orthodoxy to the very idea of monarchy. When she came of age in 1644, she took the reins, but not as her father had. She refused to marry, defying the dynastic imperative. She filled her court with Jesuits, philosophers, and artists, alarming the Lutheran clergy. And in 1654, at the height of her power, she did the unthinkable, abdicated. She converted to Catholicism, moved to Rome, and left the throne to her cousin, Charles X. Gustav. It was a seismic shock, but the empire held, because the system Oxenstierna built was stronger than any one ruler. Charles X launched a daring war against Poland, culminating in the march across the Belts, a legendary winter crossing of frozen sea ice to attack Danish-held islands. It was a gamble that paid off, forcing Denmark to cede Scania, Halland, Bleking, and Bohuslän in the Treaty of Roskilde, 1658. Territories that had been Danish for centuries. For the first time, Sweden controlled all of southern Scandinavia, securing its dominance over the Baltic Sea, the Mare Nostrum, as Swedes called it. But the empire was brittle. The new provinces were resentful. The peasantry was taxed to exhaustion. And the great powers Russia, Brandenburg, Denmark were recovering, rearming, and plotting revenge. The cracks would not show until the reign of Charles XII, the last great warrior king of Sweden. Born in 1682, Charles was brilliant, fearless, and fanatically devoted to the idea of Swedish supremacy. At 18, he faced a coalition of enemies: Peter the Great of Russia, Augustus the Strong of Poland, Saxony, and Frederick IV of Denmark, all seeking to dismantle the Swedish Empire. What followed was the Great Northern War, 1721. At first, Charles was invincible. He crushed the Danes in weeks. He defeated the Russians at Narva in 1700, with a force 1/5 the size of Peter's army. He invaded Poland, dethroned Augustus, and installed a puppet king. For a decade, He roamed Eastern Europe like a force of nature, winning battle after battle, refusing compromise, demanding total submission, but his hubris would be his undoing. In 1709, he invaded Ukraine, hoping to link up with Cossack rebels against Peter. But Peter had scorched the earth. Winter came early, and at the Battle of Poltava, the Swedish army, exhausted, starving, and outnumbered, was annihilated. Charles fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he spent years in exile, plotting a return that never came. Meanwhile, Sweden's empire crumbled. Russia seized Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and founded St. Petersburg on Swedish soil. Prussia and Hanover took Bremen and Verden. Even Norway launched raids on the western frontier. When Charles finally returned in 1714, Sweden was a shadow of its former self. He died in 1718, shot through the head while inspecting siege lines in Norway, perhaps by a Swedish soldier tired of endless war. The Treaty of Nystad, 1721, ended the war. Sweden lost all its eastern territories. Russia emerged as the new Baltic power, and Sweden's era as a great power was over. But the kingdom survived, because the foundations laid by Gustavus and Oxenstierna were not just military, they were institutional. A centralized state, a professional bureaucracy, a standing army, and a sense of national identity had taken root. Sweden would never again conquer empires, but it would learn to endure. And in the quiet aftermath of imperial collapse, a new experiment would begin, one that would redefine Swedish power not through war, but through peace, parliament, and principle. The Treaty of Nystad, 1721, did not just end the Great Northern War, it shattered Sweden's self-image. For over a century, the nation had believed itself destined to rule the Baltic, to be the Protestant sword of the North, the equal of France or Habsburg Austria. Now, its eastern territories, Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, Kexholm, were gone, swallowed by the rising Russian Empire. Its influence in Germany had evaporated. Even its southern provinces, newly acquired from Denmark, were simmering with resentment, their populations still loyal to Copenhagen. Worse still, the crown was bankrupt. The war had cost over 100,000 Swedish lives, a staggering toll for a population of just 1.5 million. Farms lay abandoned, forests were stripped for shipbuilding, and the peasantry, once the backbone of the Vasa and Carolingian armies, was exhausted, overtaxed, and skeptical of noble promises. Yet, out of this ruin, something unexpected emerged. Freedom. Not the freedom of revolution, but the freedom of parliamentary rule. For the first time in Swedish history, the monarchy's power was not absolute. In 1719, even before the war officially ended, the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, forced the new king, Frederick I, to accept a new constitution, the instrument of government of 1719, which transferred nearly all executive power to the estates of the realm. This began the Age of Liberty, Frihetstiden, a 52-year experiment in near-republican governance that was unique in 18th century Europe. Power now resided in the secret committee of the Riksdag, dominated by two rival factions, the Hats and the Caps. The Hats, backed by France and representing the nobility and mercantile elite, dreamed of restoring Sweden's greatness through war and diplomacy. They saw Russia as the eternal enemy and believed that with French gold and clever alliances, Sweden could reclaim its lost glory. The Caps, supported by Britain and Russia, and aligned with the clergy and peasantry, argued for peace, fiscal responsibility, and free trade. They believed Sweden's future lay not in battlefields, but in workshops, forests, and ports. For decades, these factions vied for control, alternating in power, passing laws, starting wars, and reforming the economy. Remarkably, despite their rivalry, they maintained one principle: no return to royal absolutism. And in this turbulent democracy, Sweden experienced a cultural and intellectual flowering. The Swedish Academy of Sciences was founded in 1739. The press was free, one of the first nations in the world to guarantee it in law, 1766. Philosophers debated Locke and Montesquieu. Economists studied Adam Smith before he was famous. And scientists like Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, cataloged the natural world from Lapland to Skåne, turning Sweden into a hub of Enlightenment thought. But the Age of Liberty was not without its fractures. In 1741, the Hats launched a disastrous war against Russia, the Russo-Swedish War, 1741-1743, hoping to exploit Russian instability. Instead, they suffered a humiliating defeat. The Treaty of Åbo forced Sweden to cede more territory in Finland and accept a Russian-backed heir to the throne, Adolf Fredrik of Holstein. Gottorp. The monarchy was becoming a puppet, first of the Riksdag, then of foreign powers, and the people grew weary. Peasants, though represented in the Riksdag, a radical inclusion for the era, saw little improvement in their lives. Taxes remained high, crop failures led to famines, and the nobility, though politically checked, still controlled vast estates and local justice. By the 1762, a new figure began to emerge, Gustav III, the eldest son of Adolf Fredrik. Educated in the ideals of the Enlightenment, but horrified by the corruption and factionalism of the Age of Liberty, Gustav believed Sweden needed a strong, enlightened monarch to restore order, dignity, and national pride. On the 19th of August, 1772, he staged a bloodless coup at a masked ball in Stockholm. Gustav appeared before the Riksdag in full uniform, declared the Age of Liberty over, and demanded the estates swear allegiance to a new constitution, one that restored royal authority while preserving civil liberties. Faced with the loyalty of the army and the cheers of the common people, the Riksdag acquiesced. Gustav III was not a tyrant. He abolished torture and the death penalty for most crimes. He promoted religious tolerance, though Jews and Catholics still faced restrictions. He founded the Royal Opera, the Swedish Academy, and patronized artists, writers, and scientists. He even attempted agrarian reform to improve peasant conditions, but he also censored the press, exiled critics, and ruled by decree. His vision was enlightened despotism, progress from above, imposed by a benevolent crown. Yet, his reign ended in the most medieval of ways. On the 16th of March, 1792, at a masquerade ball at the Royal Opera, ironically, the very institution he had founded, Gustav was shot by Jacob Johan Ankerström, a disgruntled nobleman enraged by the king's autocratic tendencies and his costly war against Russia, 1788-1790. Gustav died 13 days later. His final words, reportedly, "I feel sleepy now." His son, Gustav IV, Adolf, inherited a kingdom on the brink. Unlike his father, Gustav IV was pious, rigid, and deeply suspicious of the French Revolution. He saw Napoleon not as a modernizer, but as the Antichrist. This proved catastrophic. When Napoleon rose to dominate Europe, Sweden refused to ally with him. In retaliation, Napoleon pressured Tsar Alexander I of Russia to attack Sweden. In 1808, Russian forces invaded Finland. The war was a disaster. Sweden, isolated and underfunded, could not defend its eastern half. By 1809, Finland was lost, ceded to Russia in the Treaty of Frederikshamn. For the first time in 600 years, Sweden was no longer a trans-Baltic power. The loss shattered the monarchy's legitimacy. In May 1809, a group of generals and nobles staged a coup, deposing Gustav IV Adolf and exiling him. They offered the throne to his uncle, who became Charles XIII, an old man with no heirs. And so, in a desperate search for stability, the Riksdag did the unthinkable. They invited a French marshal, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, to become crown prince. Bernadotte, a former enemy of Sweden in the Napoleonic Wars, was a shrewd and pragmatic soldier. He converted to Lutheranism, took the name Charles John, and quickly became the de facto ruler of Sweden. His first act? To abandon the dream of reclaiming Finland. His second? To turn west. In 1814, as Napoleon collapsed, Charles John led a Swedish army into Norway, which had been in union with Denmark. After a brief campaign, Norway was forced into a personal union with Sweden, a compromise that gave Norway its own constitution and parliament, but shared a king with Stockholm. It was a modest gain, but it came at a price. Sweden had learned its lesson. Empire was costly, war was ruinous, and neutrality, armed neutrality, was the only path to survival. In 1812, Charles John declared, "Sweden shall never again be the battlefield of Europe." And so, as the 19th century dawned, Sweden chose peace. Not out of weakness, but out of hard-won wisdom. The age of swords was over. The age of workshops, forests, and quiet resilience was about to begin. In 1814, Sweden was one of the poorest nations in Europe. Its population of just over 2 million lived almost entirely in the countryside. Over 90% were peasants, most of them freeholders or tenant farmers, eking out a subsistence living on thin, rocky soil. There were no railroads, no factories, no electricity. The only exports of note were iron, timber, and tar raw materials shipped from remote ports like Gävle and Gothenburg to fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution. The loss of Finland in 1809 had been a national trauma, but it also forced a reckoning. Sweden could no longer rely on territorial expansion or military prestige. Its future would have to be built from within, and it began with peace. From 1814 onward, Sweden maintained a strict policy of armed neutrality. While the rest of Europe convulsed through revolutions, unifications, and wars, the Napoleonic aftermath, the revolutions of 1848, the Franco-Prussian War, Sweden stayed out. No Swedish soldier would die in foreign conflict for over 200 years, a streak that would last until 2024. This neutrality was not passive, it was strategic. It allowed Sweden to focus inward, to rebuild its economy, reform its laws, and educate its people. The first great pressure valve was immigration. Between 1850 and 1930, over 1.3 million Swedes, nearly 20% of the population, left for North America. They came from all regions, but especially from the overpopulated rural South. Småland, Värmland, Dalarna, pushed by crop failures, land scarcity, and rigid social hierarchies, and pulled by promises of free land and opportunity. They boarded ships in Gothenburg and sailed west. Their letters, home known as America letters, painted a vivid picture. Some described backbreaking labor and loneliness. Others wrote of owning land for the first time, of voting in elections, of sending money back to build new houses in Sweden, American cottages, often painted bright red with ornate woodwork, still dotting the countryside today. This mass exodus relieved demographic pressure, reduced rural unrest, and even injected capital into the Swedish economy through remittances. But it also forced the nation to ask, how do we keep our people? The answer came in reform. In 1862, Sweden passed the municipal reform, creating locally elected councils with power over schools, roads, and poor relief. In 1866, the old four-estate Riksdag nobles, clergy, burghers, peasants, was replaced with a bicameral parliament, giving greater voice to the rising middle class. Then came universal male suffrage in 1909 and women's suffrage in 1919, making Sweden one of the earliest adopters of full democracy in Europe. But political change was only part of the story. The real transformation was economic. Sweden sat on a treasure trove, iron ore in the north, Kiruna, Gällivare, vast forests stretching from coast to coast, and rivers with powerful hydropower potential. For centuries, these resources were underutilized. Now, with peace, capital, and new technology, they became the engine of a quiet industrial revolution. In the 1870 seconds, the railroad arrived. Lines snaked from Stockholm to Malmö, from Gothenburg to the iron mines of Lapland. Suddenly, timber could be shipped to sawmills, iron to ports, and people to cities. Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö swelled with workers. Factories rose along riverbanks, textile mills, match factories, thanks to Ivar Kreuger, the Match King, and, most importantly, engineering workshops. Here, in places like Västerås and Eskilstuna, a new class of inventors and entrepreneurs emerged. Lars Magnus Ericsson founded a telephone company in 1876 that would become Ericsson. Gustave de Laval invented the steam turbine and the milk separator, revolutionizing dairy farming. Alfred Nobel, though based in France, was a Swede whose fortune built on dynamite would fund the Nobel Prizes, turning Sweden into a global symbol of intellectual excellence. And then there was steel. In 1876, the Sandvik Company began producing high-quality steel alloys. In the 1890 seconds, Håkan Gustafsson and others developed new methods for refining iron using local charcoal and hydropower, creating a uniquely Swedish Osmond iron that was prized worldwide for its purity. By 1900, Sweden was no longer a backwater. It was a high-tech exporter, selling precision tools, ball bearings, SKF, founded 1907, and telephones to the world. But industrialization brought its own fractures. Cities grew faster than infrastructure. Tenements were overcrowded. Child labor was common, and a new force arose to challenge the old order: the labor movement. Inspired by socialism and trade unionism from Germany and Britain, Swedish workers began organizing. The Swedish Trade Union Confederation, LO, was founded in 1898. The Social Democratic Party followed in 1889, led by figures like Hjalmar Branting, who argued that reform, not revolution, could create a just society. Their motto, "Through struggle to joy, Genom strid till glädje," and they won. Through strikes, negotiations, and electoral politics, they secured the 8-hour workday, 1919, accident insurance, and universal healthcare pilot programs. Meanwhile, another movement was reshaping private life: the temperance movement. Alcohol consumption in 19th century Sweden was staggering, often 40 liters of spirits per person per year. Entire paychecks vanished into the local pub. Families suffered. Productivity dropped. In response, temperance leagues flourished, led often by women and clergy. They built folk parks, promoted coffee as a sober alternative, and pushed for state control of alcohol sales. This culminated in the 1922 referendum, where Swedes narrowly voted against prohibition but supported the creation of Systembolaget, the state-run alcohol monopoly that still exists today, designed not to profit, but to minimize harm. By 1914, Sweden stood at a new threshold. It was no longer agrarian, no longer poor, no longer irrelevant. It had not gained an empire, but it had built something more durable: a modern, industrial, democratic society, rooted in education, innovation, and social peace. And as the guns of August 1914 thundered across Europe, Sweden watched, not with envy, but with quiet resolve. It would not join the war. It would build the peace. When World War I erupted in 1914, Sweden declared neutrality, a policy that would define its identity for the next 77 years. Unlike its neighbors, Sweden had no territorial ambitions, no colonial entanglements, and no desire to bleed its youth for distant empires. But neutrality was not passive. It was a calculated strategy, enforced by a well-trained militia, a formidable navy, and a keen awareness of geopolitical winds. During the war, Sweden walked a tightrope. It traded iron ore with Germany, fueling the Nazi war machine in the coming decades, a fact that would later stain its moral legacy. Yet it also provided refuge to refugees and maintained diplomatic channels with the Allies. The goal was clear: survive, profit, and preserve sovereignty. The war's end brought not peace, but revolution across Europe. In Russia, the Tsar fell. In Germany, the Kaiser abdicated. But in Sweden, democracy deepened. In 1921, women gained full voting rights, making Sweden one of the first nations in the world to enfranchise all adult citizens. Then came the Great Depression. While the US and Germany faced economic collapse, Sweden's response was revolutionary. Keynesian economics before Keynes. Under the leadership of Per Albin Hansson, the Social Democratic Party launched a series of public works programs, unemployment insurance, and housing reforms. The vision? A folkhemmet, the people's home. A society where the state acted as a caring parent, ensuring security from cradle to grave. This was not socialism in the Marxist sense. It was social democracy, a mixed economy where private enterprise thrived, but profits were taxed to fund universal welfare, healthcare, education, pensions, childcare. By the late 1932s, Sweden had achieved something remarkable: economic growth and social equality, a balance the rest of Europe thought impossible. But then, World War II began. Once again, Sweden declared neutrality, but this time, the moral cost was higher. In 1940, after Germany invaded Norway and Denmark, Sweden was surrounded. In a controversial move, it allowed German troops to transit through Sweden to occupied Norway, a decision justified as necessary for survival, but condemned as collaboration. Worse, Sweden continued to export high-grade iron ore from Kiruna to Germany throughout the war. Without it, Hitler's tanks and guns would have stalled. Swedish ball bearings, precision tools, and telephones also flowed eastward. Yet, Sweden was not without conscience. It accepted 70,000 Norwegian and Danish refugees, including nearly all of Denmark's Jewish population in 1943, smuggling them across the Öresund in fishing boats. It provided asylum to Baltic dissidents and funded humanitarian efforts. After the war, Sweden faced a reckoning. How could a humanitarian nation have profited from Nazi industry? The answer came in reparations and reform. In 1945, Sweden returned $70 million in looted gold to the Allies. It opened its archives, and it doubled down on its new identity: peace, progress, and moral leadership. This became the foundation of the Swedish model. From 1945 to 1970, Sweden experienced unprecedented prosperity. Its GDP grew by 4% annually. Child poverty vanished. Literacy reached 100%. And the welfare state expanded to include universal health care, 1,955, generous parental leave, and free university education. The architect of this golden age was Tage Erlander, Prime Minister from 1946 to 1969, the longest-serving PM in any Western democracy. Under him, Sweden became a laboratory of social engineering, egalitarian, secular, and consensus-driven. But the Cold War loomed. Sweden refused to join NATO or the Warsaw Pact. Instead, it pursued active neutrality, mediating conflicts, hosting UN agencies, and speaking out against nuclear weapons. Prime Minister Olof Palme became a global voice for disarmament, development, and anti-colonialism, even as he maintained Sweden's nuclear deterrent program in secret. Palme's vision was bold: Sweden as the conscience of the world. He condemned the Vietnam War, supported liberation movements in southern Africa, and gave asylum to Chilean refugees after Pinochet's coup. At home, he championed gender equality, environmental protection, and nuclear phase-out. But his moral stance came at a price. On the 28th of February, 1986, Olof Palme was assassinated while walking home from a cinema with his wife. His killer was never conclusively identified, a mystery that shattered Sweden's myth of safety and consensus. By the late 1980s, cracks were showing in the folkhemmet. Globalization, immigration, and rising costs strained the welfare state. Critics called it bureaucratic, inefficient, and unsustainable. Younger Swedes began to question whether equality should come at the cost of individual freedom. Then, in 1991, the Berlin Wall fell. The Cold War ended, and with it, Sweden's moral mission lost its clarity. The era of consensus was over. A new century loomed, one of diversity, doubt, and difficult choices. But before we leave the 20th century behind, we must confront a story that runs parallel to Sweden's progressive image: the long suppression of the Sami people. For over 10,000 years, the Sami have lived in the Arctic and subarctic regions of what is now northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula. They are not a monolithic group, but a collection of distinct communities: coastal Sami, forest Sami, and reindeer-herding Sami, each with their own dialects, traditions, and relationships to the land. Long before Sweden existed as a kingdom, the Sami thrived as hunters, fishers, and gatherers. By the 16th century, many had adopted reindeer pastoralism, a semi-nomadic lifestyle that followed seasonal migration routes across hundreds of kilometers. Their society was organized around sidas, kin-based cooperative units that managed land, herds, and justice through consensus, not hierarchy. But as the Swedish state expanded northward during the 16th and 17th centuries, it did not see partners in the Sami. It saw subjects, resources, and obstacles. The first encroachment was economic. Swedish and Finnish settlers moved into Sami lands, clearing forests for farming, fishing in ancestral waters, and establishing tax collection posts. The Sami were forced to pay tribute in furs, fish, and later, reindeer to a crown they had never consented to. Then came the church. Lutheran missionaries arrived in the 1600s, determined to stamp out Sami shamanism and replace it with Swedish Christianity. Sami drums, sacred objects used for healing, divination, and communication with the spirit world, were seized and burned. No ID. Sami shamans were labeled witches, persecuted, and sometimes executed. One of the most infamous episodes was the Vapsten witch trials of 1692, where Sami spiritual leaders were tortured and forced to confess to pagan sorcery. The drums that survived were sent to museums in Stockholm and Copenhagen as trophies of conversion. But the most insidious tool of assimilation came later: education. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Swedish state established boarding schools for Sami children. They were taken from their families, often against their parents' will, and sent to institutions where they were forbidden to speak their language, wear traditional clothing, or practice Sami customs. Teachers told them their culture was primitive, their beliefs backward, their identity shameful. This was not accidental. It was policy. Official documents from the time speak openly of the need to civilize the Sami, to make them useful citizens by erasing everything that made them Sami. The goal was cultural homogenization, a unified Swedish nation, with no room for indigenous difference. Even land rights were denied. Unlike in Norway or Finland, Sweden never signed a treaty with the Sami. Instead, it claimed absolute ownership of all northern land under the doctrine of terra nullius, the false idea that Sapmi was empty before Swedish settlement. Reindeer herding was tolerated only as a customary right, not a legal one, leaving Sami communities vulnerable to mining, logging, and hydroelectric projects that flooded ancestral grazing lands. In the 1950s and 60s, the Swedish state funded large-scale hydroelectric dams in the Luleå River Valley. Entire Sami villages were submerged. Sacred sites were drowned. Migration routes for reindeer were severed. Compensation was minimal or non-existent. It wasn't until the 1972 that the Sami began to organize politically. Inspired by global indigenous rights movements, Sami activists formed the Sami Association of Sweden and demanded recognition, language rights, and land restitution. Their protests grew louder when the Swedish government approved the Kebnekaise mining project and the wind farms of Storuman, both on traditional herding grounds. In 1986, after decades of pressure, Sweden established the Sami Parliament, Samedigi, an elected body with advisory powers on cultural and educational matters. But it had no authority over land or resource management, the very issues most critical to Sami survival. The reckoning deepened in 2000, when the Swedish government formally apologized for its historical treatment of the Sami. In 2023, a historic court ruling in Girjas recognized the Sami village's exclusive right to manage hunting and fishing in its territory, a landmark decision that challenged centuries of state control. Yet, the struggle continues. Today, only 15,000 people in Sweden identify as Sami. Many live in urban areas, disconnected from language and tradition. Only 2,000, 3,000 speak a Sami language fluently, most of them elderly. Reindeer herding, once a way of life for thousands, is now practiced by fewer than 2,500 people, squeezed between climate change, predators, and industrial development. But there is also resilience. Sami artists like Sofia Janek and Maxida Marek blend joik, traditional Sami song, with modern music to reclaim their voice. Sami language preschools are opening. Young activists are using social media to demand free, prior, and informed consent on all projects affecting Sapmi. And in 2024, Sweden took a tentative step toward truth by establishing a Truth Commission on Sami history, modeled on similar efforts in Canada and Norway. This is not just a Sami story. It is a Swedish one, because a nation cannot claim to be a beacon of human rights while ignoring the wounds it inflicted on its own people. The Sami are not a footnote in Swedish history. They are its oldest continuous presence, and their survival is not a relic of the past, but a living demand for justice in the present. 10. The 1,990 seconds began with a shock. In 1991, the Cold War ended, and with it, Sweden's moral mission as a neutral peace broker lost its clarity. Almost immediately, the nation faced another crisis, a severe economic recession. The banking sector collapsed. Unemployment soared to over 10%. The Swedish krona was devalued. And for the first time in decades, the welfare state once seen as unshakable was questioned. In response, Sweden made a historic pivot. In 1995, after a narrow referendum win, it joined the European Union, a decision that ended centuries of formal neutrality in foreign economic policy. The move was controversial. Critics feared loss of sovereignty, erosion of the welfare model, and unchecked immigration. Supporters argued that in a globalized world, Sweden could not afford to stand alone. The 1,990 seconds also saw the rise of digital innovation. From the ashes of industrial decline, a new Sweden emerged not in steel or timber, but in software, telecommunications, and design. Ericsson led the global rollout of mobile networks. Spotify was founded in 2006 inches, Stockholm, revolutionizing music consumption. IKEA, already a global brand, became a symbol of Swedish minimalism and egalitarian design. But the most profound change was demographic. Starting in the 1,970 seconds with labor migration from Southern Europe and the Middle East, and accelerating in the 1,990 seconds with refugees from the Yugoslav wars, Sweden became increasingly diverse. By the 2000s, immigration shifted again, with large numbers arriving from Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. Sweden responded with one of the most generous asylum policies in Europe. In 2015, during the Syrian refugee crisis, it accepted over 160,000 asylum seekers, the highest per capita in the EU. This open-door policy was rooted in Sweden's post-war identity: humanitarian, progressive, and morally responsible. But it also sparked backlash. The Sweden Democrats, Sverigedemokraterna, a party with roots in far-right and neo-Nazi movements, began to gain traction by campaigning on anti-immigration, anti-EU, and Swedish values rhetoric. Once shunned by all major parties, they entered parliament in 2010, and by the 2022 held the balance of power in a deeply fragmented Riksdag. This shift reflected a broader tension between Sweden's universalist ideals and growing anxieties over integration, crime, and cultural identity. In cities like Malmö and parts of Stockholm, segregated neighborhoods with high unemployment and limited Swedish language proficiency became flashpoints for social unrest. In 2022, riots erupted in Easter over Quran burnings, exposing deep fractures in social cohesion. Meanwhile, the welfare state, once the pride of the folkhemmet, faced new pressures. Privatization of healthcare and elderly care, begun in the 1990s, led to uneven access and rising inequality. Housing shortages in urban centers priced out young people, and gender equality, long a hallmark of Swedish policy, was challenged by conservative religious communities that rejected state mandates on schooling and family life. Yet, Sweden remained a global leader in renewable energy, gender parity, and innovation. It set a goal of net zero emissions by 2045. It ranked consistently among the top nations for press freedom, education, and quality of life. But the final rupture with Sweden's 200-year-old identity came in 2022. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sweden abandoned its policy of neutrality and applied to join NATO, a decision finalized in March 2024. This was not just a military realignment. It was a historical watershed. The nation that had stayed out of every European war since 1814 was now entering a mutual defense pact. The Lion of the North had traded its solitary vigil for collective security. Why? Because the world had changed, and Sweden could no longer afford to be a spectator. Today, Sweden stands at a crossroads. It is still a beacon of social democracy, but one grappling with globalization, identity, and the limits of its own ideals. It is still a humanitarian leader, but one reckoning with the complexities of integration. And it is still a peaceful nation, but one that now carries the shield of an alliance born in war. The Sweden of Gustav Vasa, of the folkhemmet, of Olof Palme, those eras are not gone, but they are evolving, because history does not end. It only turns the page. And the next chapter, written in the voices of young Swedes, immigrants, Sami activists, climate scientists, and soldiers, is still being written. So, as you listen to this, in whatever corner of the world you call home, know this: Sweden's story is not just about kings and empires, neutrality and welfare. It's about a small nation in the far north, constantly asking itself, who are we? And who do we want to become? And perhaps, in that question, we all find a mirror. If you've made it this far through ice, empire, war, welfare, and renewal, thank you for journeying with us tonight. If this deep, immersive exploration of Sweden's complete history helped you drift toward calm, please consider liking this video and subscribing. And if you're moved to, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's a quiet strength in knowing we're not alone in the hush. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as vast and resilient as the land we've just left behind.